that it? Well, we're gonna trade off, so I'll just hold it for right now. Okay. Okay, we had the opportunity to go to Amsterdam and Copenhagen in October to look at bicycle. Well, we were looking to a large extent at off-street trails, but since so much of the bikeway system in Copenhagen and Amsterdam is actually on-road treatments that they call off-street, there's really a blurring and a blending that we'll talk to you about today. I just wanted to mention that in 1996, I had an opportunity to visit these cities as well as 14 other bicycle-friendly cities when I was the bike coordinator for the city of Portland, working with Rob Burchfield then and Roger Geller, and came back and started working towards integrating more innovative design treatments into Portland back then, and it was very gratifying to come back 12 years later and see that what we were doing here in Portland was really right on, that we were right on track, and that to keep going and keep learning from abroad was really going to serve us extremely well in the future. So this is an overview presentation that I've put together with help from Rob, and I also have a sort of a lessons learned document that I put together. I only brought 10 copies. It is on our website, www.altaplanning.com, so you're welcome to download it and use it as you will to help further this conversation in the U.S. as we talk more and more about these types of bike facilities. So I'm just going to go over a couple of quick trends, what we've learned in terms of cycle tracks and what that is, and then some other specific design elements of cycle tracks that Rob's going to talk about, and some other trends that we saw. Just first, I want to point out that there's kind of this interesting pattern that we've learned about. I think so many times we think about European cities and we think, well, they've just been biking forever. It's in their blood. We can't possibly be as bike-friendly as they are because they've just always been biking. And actually, since I work all around the country, that's what everybody says about Portland. But we all know the reality is we've really invested in infrastructure and promotion here, and we've realized this vision through our work. And what we found in Europe, what you see in Europe, is actually the trend is pretty similar. Back in the 1950s, they had bicycling at a very, very higher, a much higher level. And post-World War II, it dropped way down in the 70s. And this is the Netherlands down here, here, that dropped way down. And what they started doing strategically at that point was reinvesting in bicycle infrastructure and promotion. Same thing in Denmark. The trend is the same. So although we're starting from much lower levels, the trend is the same in that we're starting at a low level and we're trying to get ourselves higher, and the investment in bicycle infrastructure gets us there. This slide shows the trend in kilometers cycled per inhabitant per day in the Netherlands and England, and you can see that it is also going up over time from the 70s. The trend is upward. And then you can see that as they've invested in bikeway facilities, they've seen the trend in cycling fatalities plummet down to lower levels. Similar to the trends we've seen here in the here in Portland, actually, that Roger's documented very well, that the more we've seen bicycling increase, the better safety has become for all of us that are cycling. And then just specifically in the Netherlands, as the bike use has trended up, the cyclists killed has gone down. So as cycling has gone up, the number of cyclists killed has gone down. And now here in 2005, they've actually seen those charts intersect. So what we're going to talk about today primarily is what is a cycle track. And the cycle track combines the user experience of a bike lane with, well, of a separated path with a bike lane. It's attached to the sidewalk realm more than it is attached to the road realm, although there's a lot of blurring of that. And Rob's going to talk about a lot of the details. But basically, this is your basic infrastructure. Sorry. It's a separate level from the sidewalk or separated from the sidewalk in some way. If there's on-street parking, it's on the outside of the cycle track, and it's separated from the roadway by some kind of curbing or separation of some sort. And this is in Copenhagen, which we all found to be, we found that there's a lot of lessons we can learn from Copenhagen, a very predictable traffic system and very big streets and a big cosmopolitan city. And we did want to point out that we have some mini versions of cycle tracks here, and there's some being talked about now in Portland. And over here, as part of the Tillamook Bikeway, as it goes through Hollywood, there's a very small piece of Hancock at 44th where long ago we widened the sidewalk a little bit and put in a block of contraflow cycle track and painted a bike symbol on the sidewalk, so it's sort of a cycle track. And then I was, at the airport, you've all seen that there's a path near the airport. It's a two-way path. It's separated from the road a little bit, so it's sort of like a two-way cycle track, and the terms are a bit blurred, but we're starting to do that. And then you've all heard about 9th Avenue in New York, I think. A lot of you have heard about the great stuff that's happening in New York, and what they've done there is take the first step towards doing like a demonstration cycle track with 9th Avenue. They've seen very high usage, going from almost no use to very high use, and it's extremely popular. Then Cambridge, Massachusetts, the bike coordinator there has a longtime partner from Denmark, and they actually have a long-distance relationship that's been going on for a very long time. And so they've worked together, they collaborated on creating a very Danish-style cycle track on Vassar Street in Cambridge using the blue that we used here that I brought back from Copenhagen in 1996.
Terrific. Thanks, Mia. What I was fascinated about were the bikes' design as transportation. They used very little fancy lightweight road bikes, and everything was in a very functional manner. That's Metro Councilor Rex Burkholder there, who was on our trip, and if you look at the rear fender, all the webbing there is designed as a skirt guard. So a lot of women do use dresses and skirts getting to and from, and there's a lot of men who ride that style of bikes as well. What I found interesting was in Amsterdam, they had basic one-speeds that were in really poor shape, and they have a high theft rate in Amsterdam that they're working on to try to reduce. But the bikes were, I think maybe because a lot of them get thrown in the canals is the problem they have. But in Copenhagen, the quality of bikes is up dramatically. There's many 3-speed and 8-speed internal hubs, very few derailleured bikes in Copenhagen. And when it's flat, it's a lot easier to ride a heavier bike, the distances that they're going. But it's a stark contrast from what we ride here. And then what I found extremely fascinating are cargo bikes, and they probably had 8 or 10 different styles of cargo bikes. And as we rode around, it was fascinating to see just how they maneuvered with everybody else. The most popular one was the one on the bottom. There's a better picture of it. It's called, I believe, Nahola is the way it's pronounced. And they had the bottom half was that configuration, but then they had lots of different ways of covering the kids or the gear that was inside. But they use them for cargo bikes, they use them for carrying kids, and many different styles of just getting to and from work with whatever they had to carry. The other fascinating part is just the technology they use with drum brakes and disc brakes and articulated steering and kids in the front and kids in the back. So we've done a good job here in Portland of learning from that, and there's a great shop called Clever Cycles who have been importing a product similar to this called a Burchfield, and they've done very well with that and distribute it nationally. And well, and there's more products that are becoming available. So,
okay.
Rob?
Do you want me to flip slides, or do you want to
Yes, that'd be great. I'm Rob Burchfield, City Traffic Engineer for the City of Portland. As a delegate on this Metro-sponsored trip, one of my goals was to really learn how the Danes and the Dutch designed, operated their cycle tracks, and what are the key issues in terms of, if we're going to repeat this experience here and take the best of what they've already experimented with for 30 years, what can we learn from that and take away? So the first aspect of it is how, with a cycle track, there's some form of separation, either horizontal separation and buffering or vertical separation from the roadway. The example on the top left there shows a channelized cycle track in Amsterdam. An interesting thing, it doesn't jump out at you from the slides, but in Amsterdam, everything is basically built with blocks. They're permeable, it's built on sand, the canal's right there, their drainage issues are totally different than ours. So creating a channeled space like this where water might be retained in our streets where we build with asphalt or concrete is not an issue there. So that's an example that we may not be able to repeat here unless we did some things with drainage that they don't do there. I think a better example for us is the type of construction that we saw in Copenhagen, which is on the right there, where they have a vertical separation of about 3 inches of the cycle track from the roadway height, and then another 3-inch curb height when you go to the sidewalk. The picture there basically shows how they build just a little mountable ramp there, so whether a driveway is crossing that or whether bikes are ramping down. And we saw literally thousands of these out there. It seemed like every place you needed a little ramp to get off the cycle track, they built one for you. The bottom example is from Sweden. Again, that's an example of just like a median separation to keep the cycle track separated from the through cars. So we didn't take tape measures with us, but we had quite a bit of discussion about, well, how wide is this stuff? And so after the trip, we communicated with some of our peers in Copenhagen and came up with these dimensions for the typical widths of cycle tracks. So that first dimension is really a cycle lane. So when the cycle track drops and becomes a lane at an intersection, they use basically the same dimensions that we do. In Copenhagen, if they have a raised cycle track, the minimum width that they'll have is 6.5 feet. I'm going to go back, Mia. But their typical configuration is 2.2 meters, or just a little bit over 7 feet. And then where they're doing new construction, they go to 2.5 meters, which is about 8 feet. So that's now many of their cycle tracks, they're heavily used. So you're being passed a lot. So having that additional width so that people can comfortably pass is good. And they're saying that, they're in a lot of cases now, for capacity reasons, they're going up to 3 meters or more to provide additional capacity, essentially multi-lane cycle tracks. There's a question about, in Amsterdam, you'll see more of the situation of a buffer. But if depending on the width of the cycle track, a buffer may be a good idea to create the adequate space for a car opening door. In Copenhagen, essentially, they incorporate that width in the total cycle track width. So depending on the situation and the width of the cycle track, you may want to add then this buffer idea. So here's some drawings that show how those dimensions would be incorporated. The example on the left shows parked cars. The example on the right shows how you might do this with like an interim treatment if you did not have actual physical buffer or raised median. So the cycle track, the concept is that it operates in a continuous environment. So you don't see the cycle track elevation going up and down as you go across driveway entrances, etc. The vehicles that are going to cross the cycle track essentially have to cross at the cycle track grade. And in the picture on the left, you'll see that the 2 bike stencils there are giving warning to the motorist that they're crossing the cycle track, i.e. that's the conflict point. In Copenhagen, you'll also see a lot of use of the blue color for conflict. In Amsterdam, their signature is the red cycle track, which they do basically with a dye in the pavement, but it makes it very visible that this is the bike space. Did you want to add anything?
I think that we have to all recognize that one of the limitations of applying the cycle track to the U.S. is this very issue of we have far more driveway crossings interrupting our sidewalk, and particularly on our short, well, I know many of us fantasize, oh, wouldn't it be great to have these, but think about our downtown blocks of 200 feet in Portland with broken up by driveways, garage entrances. It's a bit challenging, and so there's a lot of communities around the U.S. that are looking at cycle tracks, and my company's been involved in a number of them. But what we've been looking at is places where there's a long, unbroken sidewalk with limited driveway crossings as the best opportunity, the safest, most secure place to start introducing these in the U.S.
Good point, Mia. Thank you. So one of the big challenges, how do you deal with these points where there are conflicts, especially intersections? In the photo on the top left there, what you'll see is that the cycle track basically drops to grade and becomes a cycle lane on the intersection approach. If there was parking there, and the next slide I'll show you this, that parking would drop as you approach the intersection. So essentially now the vehicles have an unobstructed view of the bikes as they're dropping down off the cycle track and into the cycle lane. And so that this issue of the right hook crash, which we have problems with here, they also have problems with there. And their designs are meant to address that. in Copenhagen and Amsterdam, you find that the drivers are very respectful of the cyclists. They will give way. But you do have a lot of conflicts going on out there. You can't always be sure that you were seen by the motorist, et cetera. In the example on the bottom left, do you want to comment on that one, Mia?
We did see in a number of locations that they are using at intersections. In Copenhagen, we saw this a lot, which is why we started doing this in Portland, is that they use a colored asphalt or a colored plastic, thermoplastic, the blue in Copenhagen, or in this case, this is an example in Munich, to delineate a crosswalk-like area for bicyclists that I've just been calling cross-bike. And we saw a lot of these in a number of different locations, so this is something that we'd just be aware of.
Yeah, I think in the picture here, you can see that the cycle track is kind of coming off a sidewalk-like environment, so it's operating really more like that crosswalk type treatment that Mia mentioned. These are more of the Copenhagen examples. The one on the left, I believe, I'm pretty sure was as a part of, they have sort of a greenway route. It's a two-way cycle track that's like a rails to trails facility. So it's coming out and intersecting with a major street here. So they've essentially created another one of these cross-bike treatments right next to where they have a heavy volume pedestrian crossing. So there's signalized treatment there for the bikes and the peds. In the example on the right, what you're seeing here, this is a more typical intersection example, and you can't see the far side of that intersection very well, but if you followed the blue, what you would see here is this is an example of how a cyclist would make a Copenhagen left. They would go across the intersection and then align themselves to cross to the left, and we'll show another example of that. So another feature that you see there we don't see very much of here, but it makes a lot of sense. If a third of the trips on the street system are bicycles, well then you need some more traffic control for bicycles, and so you have bicycle-specific signals at many of the busier intersections. That works well. This can work well when you have heavy volumes to separate, say, the right turn movement from the through bicycle movement. So it often ends up in prohibiting the right turn on red for cars, which is much more prevalent in all these European countries. It gives you the opportunity to provide a separate phase for bikes or an advance kind of queue jump for bikes. It does end up oftentimes that the left turns for bikes occur in a different manner than we would do here, rather than bikes operating like a vehicle to make a left turn and trying to merge across, getting a left turn lane or get in position to make a left turn. They're oftentimes making what we're going to refer to as the Copenhagen left, where they cross the intersection and then make a two-stage crossing.
Just go over the bike heads.
Within the signal heads, you'll see some of the treatments. The one on the upper left has a countdown signal. So as soon as the bike gets red, they see the countdown. This was done in Amsterdam. I like this a lot because you immediately knew, okay, I just have to sit here and wait for 20 seconds and it's counting down, and it kind of goes quickly, and then you get your indication, you go. They do a good job of differentiating signal heads, so bikes know which ones are theirs and cars know which ones are theirs. They do that by either putting this bicycle emblem within the signal head, or in Copenhagen, the bottom right example, you'll see an LED bike at the top of that smaller signal head. They locate the signal head in the Copenhagen example here near side, so it's right there where the cyclist is stopped. They will have far side as well, but it makes it very easy for the cyclist to recognize their signal. In Copenhagen, they have another thing that they do with, they give you a 2-second yellow before the green. So if you're a cyclist, it's like, okay, get ready to go. And it seemed to be very efficient. You know, rather than people kind of being caught daydreaming, you're like, oh, yeah, your pedal's in position, you're ready to ride. And so that startup delay time is not kind of, wasted there. It does, one of the challenges for us is, if you take time to add phases for bikes, oftentimes it's going to result in a longer signal phase. Here's an example of sort of this capacity issue and how they're dealing with it in Copenhagen. They've created essentially a through bike lane and a right turn bike lane. It allows a slip lane for the bikes that are turning right to proceed, and allows more space for bikes to queue at the signal.
And then the right turn. The key thing is that the right turn, the motorist movements are separated from the bicyclist movements. So the motorist has a green to go straight while the bicyclists can go straight when motorists are not allowed to turn right. So all of the movements are separated, so there's very little conflict.
So this is an example, and me and I have both kind of struggled with, how do you tell people with we need a movie, really, is what we need to show you. But basically, in 3 steps, a cyclist is approaching an intersection on the photo on the upper left. As they get near that intersection, they get channelized into this cycle track where you'll see the guy with the white shoes is basically walking a cycle track. So if you're the cyclist, you'd be approaching there. And then they're channeled to the right as they enter the intersection area, so you see a yield point down here, and then where you see the scooter, correct, Mia? Mm-hmm. Now they've lined themselves up to make that 2-stage left turn. And so that's pretty prevalent both in Amsterdam and in Copenhagen. They do it everywhere. You don't have the option of making a left turn in what we would call a conventional manner.
But he's not going to turn left on isn't he usually going to end up on the right side of the street?
Well, this thing is confusing because, well, it was just, there's all kinds of stuff going on here with transit lanes and other things. So this example maybe doesn't work well, but if you just think of the jug handle movement, that's what's happening here.
It's not a jug handle. You go through and then left to end up on the right side.
Use the microphone.
Well, let's clarify that later, yeah. I think you'll see a couple other examples here. This is a bike-only signal upper left. This is more like what we would call a scramble phase. So bikes are on the right side. They're allowed to move independently when there's no other movements and kind of go diagonally across the intersection. This is similar to what we have when you're coming off the steel bridge in northeast or north. And then this bottom example is maybe a better example of what's called a jug handle left, where the bike is essentially ducking out in the space to their right, and then they're lining themselves up to cross in that space where the crossing is. Another aspect that's prevalent in Europe is you'll see the use of yield signs, especially around bike facilities. They basically don't use the stop sign in the same manner that we do. So yield is the dominant control. That's good for bikes in that, if you don't have to stop, don't have to put your foot down, you can continue your momentum.
The striking feature of Copenhagen is the predictability. Every single cycle track is one way on each side of the road, very similar to the way we do bike lanes here. There's always the jug handle or the Copenhagen left. You're not allowed to make a left from the left turn lane. Nobody's allowed to make a right turn on red. Most of the major streets have a cycle track. It's very clear and predictable, and the signals are separated. As Rob said, Copenhagen has a 36% bike mode share at this point. That's not always the way it was. They've increased it over time, and their goal is to get to 50%. So they're very aggressively pursuing more and more treatments. Now, and I've certainly heard a lot of confusion about whether a cycle track is one way only or whether it's 2 ways. I can't tell you exactly the correct terminology to use, but I can tell you that we did see 2-way cycle tracks in Amsterdam, and there are a lot of them all over. In fact, when we were meeting with the folks in Copenhagen, they said, we do 1-way cycle tracks. That's the only way we do it. But over on the other side of the water in Sweden, they do 2-way cycle tracks. They have a lot more crashes, but it works for them. They're fine with that. So, but there are a lot of 2-way cycle tracks, and this is an example in Amsterdam. We pulled some examples from other cities where you see 2-way cycle tracks. Obviously, the complication of dealing with the driveways and intersections with 2 ways instead of 1 is infinitely more complex and challenging when you have 2-way traffic on one side of the road. So I would say this is, in terms of thinking about this as a U.S. treatment, is even more challenging to think about integrating in a safe manner.
However, while they do some 2-way cycle tracks, when we asked them questions about multi-use trails, we got kind of blank stares. It did not translate. They don't do that. They would look at us like, why would you do that? They separate bicycles and pedestrians almost exclusively. There's rare occasions when you'll see environments where they purposely mix them.
I think that's a really good point, because our crew that went over there were really looking at what we think of as what we call multi-use trails in this region, shared use path, multi-use trails. And we always mix pedestrians and cyclists, right, on our separated paths. But in reality, everything that they did, they were very clear. No, we put in a cycle track, but pedestrians are over here. And they were very perplexed by the idea that we would mix pedestrians and cyclists. So, Okay, now we're on to some really fun stuff. Just tell you about a few more things, and then we'll wrap up and have time for questions. In Copenhagen, on one of their major streets, they've got 36,000 bikes a day. Now, that's a lot of bikes. I know we're very excited in Portland. The bike counts this summer have showed that we have about, 16,400 or something bicyclists per day on the 4 downtown bridges. So that's awesome, fantastic. So they have 36,000 bikes a day on one major road and a number of roads with similarly high numbers of cyclists. And this street, so what they've done is the cycle track was too congested. So they first started taking off on-street parking and encroaching into the travel lanes, taking space away to widen it. But they realized even then there's just an awful lot of cyclists. It's very congested, and there's more crashes, and it's harder to get more people out cycling because there's so many cyclists already that people are afraid to bike with so many cyclists that are out there, which is a great problem to have. So they created this thing called the green wave. So on the street during rush hour, and the sign shows it says green wave, 6:30 to 12 in the morning. So it's like a rush hour condition on one side or the other. If you go 20 miles an hour, you're going to hit a whole series of green lights. 20 kilometers, sorry. Or roughly 12 miles an hour. You're going to hit a whole series of green lights that allow you to do this for many miles without having to slow or stop at all. It's very cool. It's very cool.
Cycle barometer.
And then down here is a cycle barometer. I think they have one like this in Eugene that Jay is examining and Rex is oohing and eyeing over here. That as you go through, it's an automatic counter. So it's just letting them know that just today alone they had 3,200 cyclists come through so far that day, and that over I think the year, maybe the time that this has been in, they've been seeing this go up. And I don't know what happens; it explodes at the top, I think, when it's done. We had one person on our trip that was not a daily cyclist, was not terribly confident, and she found the coaster brakes to be quite challenging and was very uncomfortable with the cycling experience, in part because there were so many cyclists and because it is very chaotic in Amsterdam and Copenhagen because there's so many cyclists and there's a lot of motorists, and when you're biking, we talk a lot, and Jennifer Dill's research here has shown that cycling is a pretty social activity. People like to ride side by side, and in Copenhagen, it's not a social activity, and we were very annoying to the locals because we're sitting talking and oohing and eyeing while they're ringing their bells very politely, going, "We're trying to get by you. We're trying to get by you. We're trying to get by you." So what they found is that in talking to people, that they want to get more people out cycling and encourage that this is a treatment. And I really envision it as: can you imagine biking on Sandy Boulevard, Northeast Sandy, with a cycle track and a green wave that got you all the way from Northeast Portland to downtown in 20 minutes without ever once having to stop? That would be cool. Okay, I do want to point out some of the challenges of cycle tracks, or some of the issues that we notice. And a big one is transit conflicts. Buses stop right on the outside of the cycle track in what would be either the parking lane or the travel lane, and they let passengers out right into the cycle track. And the bus stop where for the pedestrians is on the other side of the cycle track. And so the system in Copenhagen is bicyclists yield to the bus, but they were typically not marked as stops. And bus people, as they're coming off of the bus, would kind of hover at the edge of the bus, make sure there weren't any cyclists coming. With our type of fast road bikes here and behavior, I think that this would be a fairly challenging issue for us to figure out how to make that work. We did see one nice example here where they created like a bus stop on the outside of the cycle track, kind of similar to the streetcar, more of the streetcar track, the streetcar stop system. But this is definitely something to be aware of. I do want to point out just a little thing about streetcar tracks. In Copenhagen, they don't have streetcars, but certainly in Amsterdam, there's a ton of rails in the street. This is kind of a whole separate issue, and we have been looking at that in the Lloyd district and in the Pearl district, and looking at streetcars, and we've got a whole other set of lessons learned and guidelines on streetcars and bike interaction. It's also available on our website, so you could look at that. One issue that I just want to point out is the fleet of bikes there, as Jay said, is totally different. It's almost no single speed and fixed bikes and road bikes, and so the number of crashes on streetcar tracks, the flange gap just doesn't catch bike wheels nearly to the extent that they do here, so it's a little bit different. And then the other thing is they're almost always trying to separate the conflicts between the tracks and bikes by creating the 90-degree angle turns, either through signalization, the Copenhagen jug handle left, or aligning the bikeway in such a way that it's crossing the tracks at a 90-degree angle. Okay, since we went to look at trails, what we think of as multi-use trails, but we spent all our time looking at cycle tracks, we learned that they, in fact, in Copenhagen are thinking now about, they're just coming back. They've done a whole different thing. They started with roads, and they've come back, and these are all these red roads. These red roads are all the ones that have their highest priority bikeways, the streets with cycle tracks. And then they've come back and taken an abandoned railway and some parks and other things and started to put together more of what they think of as a recreational route. Again, to get more people out cycling, because that'll encourage more riders. They recognize that. So this is what part of the green bicycle route looks like. And again, this is the cycle part, and the pedestrians are in a separated space. We just thought it was really interesting. In one case, it does transition right to a neighborhood street, like what we would call a bike boulevard. The trail is really the bike boulevard. It's all kind of seamless. And they do tend to do something like this. They either slow bicyclists as they enter the street by either with a bike speed bump or with a rumble strip pavement, a series of strips to slow cyclists to let them know that something's going on as they enter this, and then there's yield markings. Lots of stuff related to bikeway signage. They're a whole complicated system of primary bicycle routes and green bicycle routes. This is in Amsterdam. And then these little numbers are a whole system that they developed of recreational loops where you can follow a point-to-point system of numbers in all the towns surrounding Amsterdam to do a trip. And we sort of did one. We wrote down a series of numbers on my hand. And as we biked along, I called out, 23! Next one is number 6, and we just kept going. We got a little bit lost at one point, mostly because we got unconfident about where the next sign was. And this is kind of a neat thing, is a promotional campaign they're doing that says, "Hey cyclists," something along the lines of, "You're doing a really good job. Thanks for what you're doing. Have a good day." And so they're trying to reinforce that cycling is really good for the community. Just a little bit about wheel gutters. Rob and I were getting pretty geeky there and measuring the wheel gutters and looking to see how we could make sure that when we have a staircase and we introduce a wheel gutter so that you can push your bike up and down the stairs, that it's done well. And we did notice that they tend to be more of a rectangular configuration rather than a V. That's how we've done ours. And a little bit set off from the railing, so although we might have some conflicts with the pedestrian standards and ADA on this, I don't know. So we just want to point that out. We've been talking a lot in this region about bridges and replacing the Selwood Bridge, looking at the light rail bridge. We've been working on designing a bridge called the Gibb Street Pedestrian and Bicycle Bridge. We saw a fantastic bridge in Amsterdam that we all just oohed and awed, and it connects sort of a green space to a brand new housing development area. And it's got both a long ramp for bicyclists and a shorter ramp for pedestrians, more of a tight ramp. And I think they told us it cost 33 million euros or dollars? $33 million. It's not bad at all. Some of the other innovations that we liked, Jonathan's website had this the other day, Jonathan Moss's blog. It's the idea that you're watching for blind spots with trucks. So this is in the cycle track or in the bike lane, you would see this warning sign. We did see we were wondering about one of the issues with cycle tracks that we would have to grapple with here is how do you clean them? They're separated, they're not on the road. We've worked very hard to get our maintenance bureau, and they're the best maintenance bureau here. They sweep the bike lanes. In most places, that's a struggle, getting bike lanes to be swept. And so we noticed that they had this cute little cycle track sweeper, and we might need to think about something like that here if we start to integrate these into our system, is making sure that they're well maintained. We all know we appreciate that. This is a business district where they have made it a car-free zone at different times of the day using bollards that you can electronically control with a little button, so that's nice. And then this is just a refuge that is in the middle of a road of one part of the green cycle route that you can kind of follow along. Okay, so to summarize the cycle track lessons learned is in Copenhagen we saw that really the ones that seem to be the most applicable for us to think about here are one way on each side of the street. Some range of 5-foot to 10-foot width in various situations, and not forgetting that the more cyclists we get, we do need that additional capacity in the bike lane, that having a fast-moving lane, a slow-moving lane it's not a joke, it's reality. It's similar to what you've already done on Hawthorne Bridge and has made such a difference in that corridor that we may need to think about much wider cycle tracks. And buffer would be nice, but not necessarily required. And the cycle track is always separated from the pedestrians. It's always separated from the street, and it's located in between the sidewalk and on-street parking. And then probably the key thing, the hardest thing that we're going to have to grapple with is that the cycle track takes priority, that it is unbroken, and that side street low-volume crossings and driveway crossings have to yield to the cycle track. And so training motorists and figuring out how we're going to make this work is, I just think that's the biggest challenge, one of the biggest challenges that we're going to have, in addition to the intersections, which are that we have to control the different movements very carefully so that the turning conflicts between motorists and cyclists are brought down to the absolute minimum, either through primarily through signal separation is what we saw. What Rob didn't mention is we saw in Copenhagen a variation that when you do this Copenhagen left, you're making a right turn into the intersecting street and coming up on something that's similar to a bike box. Our green bike boxes. They don't always use the actual bike box, but if they haven't, they've pulled the stop bar back 16 feet, which creates the same amount of space so that motorists are far back from the intersection. I know this is what Roger and Rob based the design on in the first place. They're using this yellow 2-second mount-up phase or a Q-jump kind of thing. They're using advanced green kind of stuff where cyclists get out in the intersection before there's any conflicts or completely separated movements. No right turn on red for any movements. Always the cyclists have to do the Copenhagen left. And again, I think that's really challenging. If we're going to have cyclists be on the right side completely, physically separated from the road, then the challenge of getting them to make a left turn, we have to think that through. Are we willing to accept some compromise in our movement, that we don't get to stick out our left hand and get over to the left lane, in order to facilitate the utility of a cycle track? So think that through, because I don't think we have a ready answer for that. I think it might be very chaotic if we start to have some intersections that have a Copenhagen left and some that don't. And every intersection has a Copenhagen left, so it's predictable. And then the issue is the buses stopping outside the cycle track. That's another issue. But then the final issue is just the wayfinding and the signage that ties it all together. Finally, I was going to say that we've been talking a lot about the Bike Boulevard symbols, and here's one that if we could bike PDX bigger, then we're all set.
A couple final comments. I didn't clarify. One of my purposes for being over there, besides looking at all the cool bikes, is one of my other volunteer roles is as a State Parks Commissioner. And State Parks is spending a lot of time looking at linear state parks and connecting green spaces. And some of the interesting facts that I were surprised about is that they're looking at cycle tracks in urban areas mainly. They've seen a tremendous increase in bikes as transportation only in urban areas. In the last 20 years, they've seen a 50% increase, and in rural areas, they've seen a 20% decrease. So from a state parks perspective, if we're looking at an urban linear state park, then it's going to be more transportation-based, where if it's a rural state park, then it's going to be more of a recreational piece. The 36 and 37% of bikes for transportation, what I found fascinating is that all three modes of transportation are split pretty evenly. It's nice to see bikes so high, but transit is about a third, cars are about a third, and bikes are about a third. And the way they get to that, partly, is they tax bikes. Excuse me, they don't tax bikes, they tax cars. There's a 180% tax on cars in Copenhagen. And then we all know they have very high gas prices as well. And just about everybody rides a bike. So the idea of getting the bike lanes swept here in Portland is easier than in other communities, and that's because we're now up to 8% of the total citywide population using bikes for transportation. And then on the inner east side, it's up to 30% of primary and secondary means of transportation are bike-related. So we have a lot of things going for us here in Portland that other communities don't. Oh, and then parking is a huge issue. In Amsterdam, they've invested $50 million in a facility underneath the train station to park up to 30,000 bikes, where in Copenhagen they haven't addressed that issue. And they've got, thank goodness, wide sidewalks where you just see bikes piled up everywhere, and public spaces that have lots of bikes, but they don't have the parking issue figured out. And as we move forward, it's an issue that we have to work with as well. So thanks.
Say a few more things, Rob? Good. And we can take questions.
Well, I'll say one technical comment. Mia commented on the transit stop issue being a challenge, and as we started looking at some of these designs, I think that is one. I think it's that we have to work on. It's really getting an ADA-compliant transit stop that's compatible with a cycle track. So I think some of the interim solutions, like you saw that New York City example, if they had transit use on the same side of the street where the cycle track was, I don't know that that's actually even doable. I think you would have to probably actually build some kind of ADA-compliant transit stop to do that. So that may be it's a technical issue we're still working out, and there's probably some good minds in this room that have ideas already that'll come up to me and tell me how to do it. But the other thing I would say is, as an experience, it was a wonderful experience for me to get to go as a delegate on this trip, and I'm very thankful to Metro for sponsoring the trip, and the German Marshall Fund, which did all of our local arrangements in Europe and did a wonderful job. But one thing you can't really share all that well in these slides is as the cycling culture in these cities, and it's very rich, it's very exuberant, and it makes cycling seem just absolutely, that you couldn't imagine the cities without the bicycle, in fact. So it gives you my sense was that I felt like I time traveled. It's like, oh, this is what Portland could be like 20, 25 years from now if we go on this path. And so it was very enlightening, that experience. And I think that that's something that we should all celebrate, is, that the cycling culture of these places makes for a very vibrant city. It makes for a healthy population, makes for an active population. And I think it does really enrich your city if you can pursue that kind of culture.
Great. All right, we have about 15 minutes before we have to shut down the computer, right? So if we have others that want to... Should we take the email questions, or? Good. Okay, Keith.
First, I need to find out where the button is. At the bottom. Oh, right here. Ah, there we go. I was struck by the picture that you had of New York City, the street section just packed with vehicles and a nice open bike lane. So I have two questions. One is, how do you think that we'll get the political will to actually redesignate space to have this happen? Because I can bet that somebody was hollering that, oh, well, we need the capacity for the cars. And then number two, where are we going to get the political will or the resources to make all these cycle tracks, and making that transition from our 0.7% capital budget for bikes that we have at PDOT now to something that obviously is far more robust.
Can't you just ask a technical question?
Well, I'll take a shot at that. I think that there is political will to do it. I think that there's an education process that's going to need to happen so the public will, one, understand, what the implications of doing these things are, what the trade-offs are, what some of the benefits are. So I think that, kind of starting these conversations is a part of that process. And thinking about our urban streets where, we might want to do this, I think the first thing we'll look at is parking. I think removing parking is going to be, one of the first things on the table. So we are working on design for the streetcar in the Lloyd District right now on Northeast 7th. And that design is going to incorporate a cycle track type of use. I think it may be, as it's initially implemented, it may be this interim type solution without the vertical separation, but will create the spatial ability to do it, and it will require parking removal on one side of the street in order for us to have the space to do that. So I think there's one example of how we've looked at that and met that challenge. Without removing the parking on one side of the street, we ended up with very narrow lanes and very narrow bike lane right adjacent to streetcar tracks. And I think that it was great that everybody in the community, even the property owners there, recognized that's not a good design. We don't like that design. That's not good for bikes. And so I think people are willing to go to that next level in order to have facilities that are quality facilities. It will be it'll be a challenge in each case, but I think there are opportunities.
I just want to point out that what they did in New York is they started this as a demonstration project, just using paint, and tried to see how it would work. I think that we were having lunch with one of the guys in New York, and we asked him, so wasn't the traffic, the traffic projection must have shown that this would be chaos, and he says, well, we just didn't do a traffic projection because of course it was going to show it was going to be bad. So the mayor and the director of the New York City Department of Transportation, Jeanette Sadiq Khan, who's a real visionary, said we're just going to do it because it's the right thing to do, and New Yorkers will adapt, and we'll give it a try. We'll see what happens, and so that's what they did. Yeah, another complicated question, Chris. It was technical. What's very striking about being in Copenhagen is the streets are a lot of them are quite wide. Really big boulevards, but yet they've really allocated a significant amount of space. And there's certainly a very high density, much higher priority there on high density living with a lot more space given over to the public realm. A lot of streets over time in Copenhagen have been turned into pedestrian malls starting in the 70s, and it was just starting in the 70s. So there's that. So I think that, the inner parts of Portland, the areas, the Pearl District, the areas that actually in the Bike Master Plan update, Roger and the steering committee and others have been talking about that could be designated as bicycle districts. Like the Pearl District certainly comes to mind, and the Macadam District as we start to, the South Waterfront as we start to build that, and all, a lot of the Inner East Side and other areas. I think these are more compatible. What they've seen in the cities in Europe is the more they put in cycle tracks, the more these business districts thrive. That taking the parking away does the exact opposite of killing the business. It brings people biking and walking right in front of their stores, and you can bring so many more people than you can vehicles, that the businesses not only thrive, but they want more of it. They want more. And we've seen that already a little bit here with businesses starting to ask for the bike corrals in front of their business, because, gosh, they can park, 12 or more bikes, 24? It's something like, I don't know what the numbers, 20 bikes for every one car, and that's better for their business. So, I think we're starting to get there. I've been working on a project in Dallas, Texas. Yes, it's true. Seriously. I'm serious about this. Downtown and uptown Dallas. I'm going there Monday night. I'm going to give a final presentation, and it's been completely financed by the major landholders in downtown and uptown Dallas that want an entire network of cycle tracks in downtown, and they're willing to take off on-street parking on many of the streets to make it happen, because they've said it's the right thing to do. We want, it's time for us to stop being addicted to the car in Dallas, Texas. So I'm here to tell you, if they make this happen in Dallas, we better be able to make it happen in Portland and in other cities as well, because there is not a more car-addicted place in the country than Dallas.
I'm interested in sort of the implications of this on our entire region here, so I have a couple of quick questions. First of all, I heard from one of the members of the delegation about the suburban part of Copenhagen, and they said it looked a lot like Portland, post-war suburban outline suburbs here. So would a cycle track be appropriate on some of those arterials that aren't as commercial, that have fewer driveways? And then my second question is about how they make a cohesive system across jurisdictional boundaries there. How do they sort of make signage and the facility types continuous as you leave Copenhagen and get into like the next town?
Okay, two-part question. I'll try to answer. I think absolutely the cycle track is applicable to suburban type situations, may even be more so. I think because you have better opportunities to do it, and it may be easier. I wouldn't say, though, that suburban Copenhagen looks like suburban Portland. The land use is still quite a bit different, the land use intensity, and they just don't orient their houses just weren't built around the car. You didn't see garages. You don't see driveways everywhere. So they have more like courtyard spaces for public, as buildings open onto courtyards and stuff. And but I think that doesn't diminish the idea that we could do cycle tracks in suburban areas. We rode the train to suburban Copenhagen and then rode our bikes back on a kind of suburban cycle track. People thought of it as, oh, well, this is like Beaverton Hillsdale Highway or sections of Barber Boulevard or something. We could easily envision that here. And then the second part of your question was how do they integrate signing? Well, they really have done a better job of designing their systems. They have guidelines for national systems for signing their routes, and they are more integrated. We spoke with a consultant who actually, his business was basically around promoting longer distance recreational routes and providing the signing and such for that. So they've given it more thought, put more effort into it. And one thing I would say, again, with their signing of all their routes is where they have sort of a route that goes onto a back street or through a park, it's always visible. There's always some type of signing that tells you it's there, and there's always some kind of follow-through signing that tells you you're on the right route and such. So even though they have a lot more cyclists there, it's much more prevalent. You could just basically follow cyclists. They still do a better job than we do with signing.
Yeah, I think that is, since you work at Metro, I think that the regional, a real opportunity here is for Metro to help take the lead in developing a signage system based on Portland's signs that everybody in the region could adopt, and helping give guidance on where they would go and when they should be applied, and it become a standard feature of every project that bikeway signing is included, so that we do get to, in short order here, a system of signs that ties to the whole region together. I'd really like to see that. Yeah, Ian?
Oh, good, it's working. I had one quick technical question, which was, did you get any measurements for two-way cycle tracks and what's recommended on those widths? And then I had another comment, which was mostly just, I really love the slide with the crosswalk and the bike section through the crosswalk. And I found that through anecdotal conversations about using crosswalks in the city of Portland as a cyclist, and we have several of those where a bikeway crosses a major street like 39th, oftentimes I think drivers still believe that they don't need to stop for cyclists who are trying to use a crosswalk unless you're actually walking your bike. So seeing some kind of treatment that prioritizes a small space for cyclists to use within the crosswalks that we have could really benefit just for that driver awareness.
The first part of your question, don't have specific dimension that we got down and measured, but I've been thinking of it as pretty much a doubling, that the minimum is a 10-foot two-way width for two-way cyclists only. And look, I have to, we have learned in this region that we're not building our facilities wide enough, and we're looking long-term. That the Hawthorne Bridge sidewalks, gosh, it was hard to get them widened to 10.5 feet, but that's not enough for shared between pedestrians and cyclists. And the Steel Bridge and the Springwater on the Willamette and the East Bank, I mean, we got every ounce of width that we could get out of those, and it's still not enough. So I don't think we quite have the answer on, how wide can you go, and I don't think we've ever gotten to the point where we think we've gone too wide yet. And the second part of your question, I just will say that I know that Roger and Rob have been looking at creating some kind of cross-bike design and have been kicking around some similar ideas. And you want to answer want to add in anything on that, or?
Well, yeah, and I think that could be a topic for more technical discussion, but I think part of the dilemma to us is we seem to be caught between treating the bike like a vehicle, which tends to be like a motor vehicle, or treating it like a pedestrian. And it's really like there is a third class, let's treat it like a bike. But under law, we've only distinguished laws for vehicles and laws for pedestrians, and then a few special things that relate to how a bike's supposed to behave, sort of thing. And so there may be some more things we need to do to sort of what I'd call create the architecture in terms of rules of the road and traffic control devices that relate to bikes. So there's a number of things that I took away from this trip is that we need to start working on. Is bike signals is one of those. Standard guidelines now for bike signals. They essentially don't they kind of don't live in traffic engineer lore right now. So we have to create that, and that's part of the hard part of being trying to get in front of this is that you kind of have to you have to do some of the heavy lifting to create these things, the standards by which you want to implement things.
I had a question kind of related to that, which is there any indication, or would you say there's a reasonable danger that more, for example, behind parked cars are going to make it more dangerous when they're mixed?
Well, obviously, the whole point is to improve safety and make it better, so that would be primary in everybody's minds. And the designs that we've showed you have been adapted over 30 years to get to that point where bicyclists are extremely visible and there are very, very few crashes. So I think that we'll be certainly very cautious in making sure that anything that's applied anywhere is as safe as possible. In the back.
Imagining what it would be like to go from where we are to something like this. And these are all after pictures, in essence, say for Amsterdam. And I wonder if you had a chance to look at photos that showed the transition from wherever they came from to where they are today. And I also think that might be an interesting aid, the next time you do this, so we can actually imagine at least some of the stepping stones that might take place.
Okay, well, I will definitely go back and see if I think that's a great idea. Thank you for pointing that out. Yeah, we actually, in fact, we were there. Rob and I took pictures of a right turn, a dedicated motor vehicle right turn lane that you could still see the remnant markings, and they were actually taking it out as we were there. There was construction crew going on, so we stopped to take a picture showing that it was in process. But yeah, I think you're right. A lot of this has happened, and a lot of it was brand new since the last 12 years since I was there. When I went there 12 years ago, they told me that almost all of that had been put in the previous 10 years to that. And in 18 cities I went to back in 1996, every single one of them said that all the stuff that I was seeing was brand new within the previous 5 years, including car-free zones in every one of the cities. So it's definitely been an evolution. In Portland, it's the same thing, though. When people come here, and in fact, how many of you haven't been here? How many of you are new to Portland in the last, 5 years? I mean, you have no idea what it was like in the early 90s. How could you know? None of the streets that have bike lanes now had bike lanes back then. We didn't have anywhere near the volume of cyclists that we have now. And folks that come here can't imagine it either. So I think that's a really good question. We do have some great, actually, slides of before pictures of what we've done in Portland, and I'm actually writing a book right now on this story, so we'll get it out. We'll get it out at some point.
You have a customer.
Okay, it's 1 o'clock, so if you need to leave, go ahead, and if you'd like to stay, we're happy to stay for another half hour.
Do we still use this thing?
Do we still have to use the, do they still have to use the thing?
Yeah, it's still on. It's still streaming.
It's still streaming, yes.
So I wanted to make a couple observations. One is about what Ken see from just going there and as you talk to people. The national legislation in the Netherlands anyway, which is something like and it really says a bicyclist is innocent unless proven otherwise. Not that the Dutch are so polite, but they have a law. The other thing is about the bike culture, which is really amazing, and you have to see it. And I would say that what's different about it is that it's not a subculture. And it has to do with how the bikes are. It has to do with those skirt guards and coat guards and chain guards and everything. So everybody's a bicyclist some of the time. And you don't change clothes to get on your bike, for sure. And it is truly not a subculture. I mean, my mom rode her bike at 80, when she couldn't really walk without a walker anymore. She could still ride a bike. So everybody is a bicyclist, and it's not a young male lycra kind of activity at all. The other thing about the trails, we didn't get to go outside Amsterdam much, it sounds like, but typically in the rural roads, they also design them like a cycle track. so they're parallel to the road, and the buffer between the roadway and the bike lane is landscaping rather than asphalt.
Okay, thank you.
Can I just make a quick comment? When our guide in Copenhagen is Michael, what's his last name? Michael. He has a couple of websites. One of them is called CopenhagenChic.com, and his whole mantra is, we Copenhageners aren't cyclists. We're just regular people who happen to ride bikes. And if you're interested in cycling culture and fashion in Copenhagen, it's a great website. And then one of the tracks we were on was outside of Amsterdam.
And had just that feature that you described. It's a green buffer. I also found it was interesting. Then we transitioned from that, where you had a separate track, onto probably what was a very low volume road that provided access just to a few homes and farms. And it was very narrow, very narrow. It was like a country lane that might be, just 12 feet wide. And we were riding towards Amsterdam at that time in what was getting close to the commuting hour. So we had cars coming at us, and I found myself, took a little while to get comfortable with the fact that cars approaching me were going to be just passing me. I could just reach out and touch them.
It's just as scary in the car.
Yeah. But you put quite a bit of confidence in other road users. So it was, though, like I said, I loved the cycling culture. There weren't all aspects of it I was immediately comfortable with in terms of the riding environment. I also found that I had to get used to head checking a lot more to the left, because there was always a cyclist overtaking me on my left. You just couldn't lollygaggle and, No, we weren't. But you're right. I think that as Mia showed you in those graphs, those charts early on in the presentation, the cycling, when your grandmother was a young person, half the country, half the trips were by bicycle. So back in the 1950s or the 40s or whatever. So there is that, there is that history in the culture that you have generations who have been doing this. I think the cultural aspect of it is really fascinating. I'd like to see somebody, do some research on it. But I think here it is evolving in a different way. It's probably evolving out of the subcultures, and there are numerous kind of cycling subcultures that we have here. But it is coming up to the point. It's now becoming, I think, more mainstream and more, more visible as a mainstream culture.
Colin?
How the 9th Avenue cycle track in New York handles the transit conflicts you mentioned.
I didn't mention it. I don't know the answer.
I think the answer, I think you can see it in the picture. I think the bus is right running and the cycle track's left running on a one-way street, so there's no stops in the cycle track. But if it was a two-way street with transit, you wouldn't have an easy solution for that.
We have a lot of these one-way streets in Portland, though.
We do.
Somebody at TriMet should look into that. Yeah. Traffic projections always show that it's going to be a disaster, but we've taken out, I think, 14.5 miles, lane miles is what you sent me yesterday, of travel lanes here in Portland, and reallocated that space to bike lanes. And on those streets, we have found that they work pretty well, and in some cases, we've seen a pretty good increase in safety on those streets. I better let Rob talk about this.
Well, I'm going to actually maybe take another thought at it, is what if you designed the street for the outcome you wanted? What if you said, we want a third of the trips to be by bicycle, so we're going to provide the infrastructure for that. We're only going to provide about a third of the infrastructure for auto, and the other third will be for transit. That's basically, I think that is really more the way they approach the problem there. Trying to forecast, I mean, it's a dilemma you can't solve. How do you forecast for the amount of possible travel demand? We can't meet that in an urban environment. So we have to designed for a constrained environment.
The other thing I'd just like to add to that is if you think about what's happened in our, this year's bike counts are showing 20% of vehicle trips on the Hawthorne Bridge are bicycles. And so if instead of taking the path we did of encouraging bicycle use, we went the way a lot of other places did, and that 20% of trips weren't on bicycles but were in cars, then the congestion would be a lot worse. And if you think about the number of trips downtown after that, congestion downtown would be a lot worse. And so, thinking in today's paradigm versus tomorrow's paradigm, saying, well, if we just model out what we're doing today and think about the capacity needs going forward, just assume that everyone's going to travel in the same way, then I don't think it's the right answer. I think the answer has to do with how do we encourage uses that take less space, make it so that congestion starts to pick up, so we're going to dedicate that space more towards use required, like moving goods, other types of things like that. So it's about that option that actually starts to ease some of those.
Developed over time, over 30 years, and so now everyone's used to it. This is completely new for the United States, and one of the major hurdles is educating motorists that, first, bikes are allowed to be in the street, which is apparently still a conflict, and now with cycle tracks, how did you look at education of motorists in Copenhagen and Amsterdam at all, like their strategies?
Not really. We didn't really look at that. I mean, we just didn't have that conversation. The person that we met with, that was the bike coordinator in Copenhagen and his team, they did talk about how they're coming back to do more outreach and trying to create a dialogue within the community about bicycle culture and what that means. So they talked about that. They showed us some of the campaigns that they're running, which you saw, like that one, just a couple of the posters. But we didn't really learn what their driver's education model is, or we do know that in many of these places, bicycle safety education is part of primary school. And so that because everybody grows up having had the experience of learning bicycle safety in school and riding a bike, that it makes intuitive sense that they're all going to be more sensitive drivers, because when they get behind the wheel of a car, they also have had the experience of probably regularly cycling. It's probably part of their normal existence that they ride a bike some of the time. So that definitely changes the culture. There's some cultural things in there about the way people drive. There's some enforcement things in there. There's some things about education. I think I don't know about continuing education. We have a problem here with nobody gets further education. Once they get their driver's license, they never have to get retested, so that's an issue too. So there's a lot of stuff we have to think about.
I think a lot of times when people say, we need better education of motorists, I think, the goal, what they're asking for is they want motorists to be more respectful and less antagonistic sort of in their behaviors towards cyclists, and I think it could go vice versa as well. But I don't think, at least we didn't really experience that. I didn't see very much conflict between, or antagonism between the motorists and cyclists. It just doesn't happen there. And so I think it's certainly less of an issue that they have to deal with.
I mean, I think Ludwig, who was here a few minutes ago, did point out that the Dutch national law puts the onus on motorists, and what they told us is it's really considered, you're not okay if you hit a cyclist. So people are embarrassed if they would hit a cyclist. So there's that. That's not the law in Denmark. We did not hear that was the law, but we all experienced this feeling of, there's this vast number of cyclists, there's a lot of motorists, these are big streets, these are congested intersections, and yet nobody's honking, nobody's flipping each other off. It was kind of an amazing feeling of civility, yet chaotic civility is the way I felt about it. Yeah.
Well, we talk a lot about mode split, and 36% mode split, but probably close to 100% of the population is cyclists at some part of the week or month
right.
per year. They will have that experience too.
Exactly.
I have a technical question. I think those utilitarian bikes are beautiful, and I'm wondering whether there are special parking facilities to lock up the cargo bikes that are really big.
I think they're beautiful too, and I really want that one. So I'm hoping Jay is going to start selling it so that I can have it.
Do you mean the cargo bikes, the larger ones, or the
They're all beautiful, but how do you lock the cargo bikes?
these bikes? Yeah. Well, because this happened mainly in Copenhagen, and Copenhagen has just a parking issue everywhere, and theft isn't nearly the issue in Copenhagen that it is in Amsterdam. If you just had that on the sidewalk with a cable through it, it would be fine. What they did see, I believe, as these have gotten more popular in very recent history, is they're now looking at the design of their cycle tracks, because you get two of these going together at the same time, or if one wants to pass another, it's a problem. And that's why they're looking at wider standards for their new cycle tracks.
In Amsterdam, they've got a huge theft problem, so everybody carries, they both have a wheel lock, the kind of circular lock that grasps the back of the wheel, and you have a key, and you just hold that. But and that's all they used in Copenhagen, all the bikes, that's all they use. They just park them on the sidewalk, that's what they use. And in Amsterdam, they all carried a huge, heavy chain with them that they use as a supplement, and much more of a theft problem. And so that's where in Amsterdam, as he said, they're looking at huge parking garages and other ways to park bikes.
I have a related question with the cargo bikes. With the jug handle turn movements and the Copenhagen left turn movements, do those accommodate cargo bikes as well as they do normal bikes?
Well, I'd say generally yes. Most of these bikes, Jay may be better to answer this question, but my impression, especially like with this one that's in the middle bottom there, the Nohola, its wheelbase is pretty short. They're pretty easy to manipulate. Some of the older designs are longer and maybe not so good. Do you want to comment on that, Jay?
The longer bikes are more difficult to ride, and the having the dual wheels makes the bike a lot easier to handle. But I'm sorry, what was the question specifically?
The Copenhagen left, can they do
Oh, the Copenhagen, right. It is more challenging on the jug handle. Is that the proper?
Yes.
It is in shorter. Technical term. It is more challenging with the longer, like the Bach feet, where you've got the big box and the front wheel out front, because it gets really tippy. And when you have the two front wheels, that stabilizes it and makes it easier to make those sharper turns.
Anyone else? Yep.
Did you see any bike infrastructure there that could be benefited by implementing practices we use here?
Well, there's a couple things, not so much the infrastructure, but I've gotten a couple emails from the guys that we visited with, and they said they were very excited about the Smart Trips program that we've got here is something that they were really excited about, the idea of that individualized marketing. They really like the Safe Routes to School program ideas, because they've been struggling to get more kids to bike and walk to school again, because even though in Amsterdam there's a ton of adults biking, that it's kind of chaotic and scary on the major roads for kids, and so they're trying to bring that back, and that had dropped way off, and they like the idea of the Safe Routes to School program. And I just got an email from the bike coordinator, was very excited about the study that we did here on the bike-related business economy and how that's really increasing, and they thought that was really interesting to look at that and see how that's beneficial to the larger citizenry to have all these entrepreneurial businesses centered around bicycling. They thought that was really interesting. So,
The one thing I experienced, this doesn't directly answer your question, but I think it's pretty close, is of the things that I saw that I thought that they could really do better was in Amsterdam, and that was bike parking. And that was more in a programmatic sense. They have a lot of people that store bikes. They'll either ride the train to come into the city and store a bike right there in the city and then get off the train and use that bike, or the other way, they'll have a bike leave a bike at the train station near their home. So in doing that, they leave bikes that are they're kind of junker bikes, or bikes that if they got stolen or damaged wouldn't be a great loss. So they're creating this extra demand for bike parking, and then the bikes themselves oftentimes may just go abandoned if they get vandalized or stolen. And they did not have a good system for getting those bikes removed. So we saw a lot of places where there's high bike parking demand. but they just had junk bikes in there, bikes with broken wheels, flat tires, and they said, well, our law says we can't remove a bike unless we've given someone like a month's notice, which was just crazy.
And so you end up seeing a bunch of bikes with pink tags hanging on them that will eventually get taken out. But I wanted to make that reference to an earlier comment I made, and that is on the trains in Copenhagen, you can bring your bikes, where in Amsterdam it's not allowed. And that might be one of the reasons why people have nicer bikes. It's because you don't want to leave a nice bike at a train station in Amsterdam overnight or for a couple of days when you've got other things to do. But in Copenhagen, you get to put your bike. They've got spots on the front car and the back car of each train that'll accept, I believe it's up to 14 bikes in slots per train, and there's a lot of trains going every hour.
The commuter rail. I actually... two things. One is that we have our ADA law is better. They don't have an ADA law there, and they haven't developed much in the way of infrastructure for people with disabilities. So that's one. Second is Copenhagen, Amsterdam, there was one thing that we saw that disturbed a lot of us, and that is there was a willingness to compromise the pedestrian space to create cycle tracks. So we saw a number of locations where, the sidewalk was down to a few feet, and the rest of the space was a cycle track. And I think that that's not something that we want to promote. We want to continue to value the pedestrian space as highly as we value what we're trying to do in bicycles.
Yeah. And just a final comment from my perspective. Between the two cities, I think Portland is absolutely a sister city to Copenhagen, where in Amsterdam it's way more touristy, and the whole sex and drugs and all the other stuff that they have going on there just breeds a whole different climate of people and tourism that I want to go back to Copenhagen, not necessarily Amsterdam.
Is there time for one?
Yeah.
I just wanted to ask about a little bit more about the bike parking situation, since that's something we deal with a lot here at the university, obviously. In Denmark, did you notice that there was this same volume of people trying to park on the street? I recently made a trip to Amsterdam, and I did notice the same thing, that there were bikes seemingly everywhere, and a lot of them looking derelict. But then also, one other factor that I noticed in Amsterdam was that it seemed like a lot of the housing was so dense that people were parking their bikes just out in front of their apartment or their row house or whatever. So it seemed that bikes weren't coming in or going into a garage or going indoors in any way. They would just be left out on the curbside, maybe locked up right in front of the door or near the front door. So I don't know if that was something, did you see stuff like that?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. We actually went and visited our friend Michael and saw that some of the housing developments that are mostly a lot of apartments, townhouses, row houses, they all have some kind of a shared courtyard with a built bike storage structure or multiple bike storage structures covered and like little sheds, not very highly technical, but enough to where the bikes were not parked willy-nilly. They were more organized in Copenhagen.
Yeah, and in Copenhagen, they had a particular type of rack that they used pretty much uniformly throughout the city. That it's a rack you couldn't lock your frame to it, but that's not an issue there because a wheel lock was sufficient for security in Copenhagen, and you would slide your bike into it. It would hold the front wheel. It could hold it's angled in such a way as your bike would enter a slot that if you had a wide wheel, it would hold it, or if you had a narrow wheel, you'd just go in a little bit further and it would hold it. And I like that because it created a pretty ordered environment, for the bikes, and you didn't see a whole lot of people just putting their bikes willy-nilly. They also did in Copenhagen a thing pretty similar to what we've done here on street, but they wouldn't even have a rack. All the bikes there, again, that's another difference. They all have kickstands, so they could just mark out a space on the street for parking bikes, and people would just park their bikes, one right next to each other, and that's a bike parking space. Hardly any infrastructure required.
However, I don't think we want to take that lesson and say that we should go back to having wheel bender racks like that, because but the orderliness and the consistency and the space, all those things are good. I just think that we don't want to take that lesson away, that we should use their racks just because they use them.
Well, I was going to say, me and I may differ on this one, but I don't think those were actually wheel bender racks because the technology is a little better. It would fit it would hold any size wheel. I think the wheel bender comes when a narrow wheel kind of flops over in it. But
A little of both. I agree with both of you.
yeah.
Always does this. The master.
Diplomat. Did that kickstand issue further did that kickstand issue further compromise pedestrian space in terms of people?
Oh, yeah.
Definitely. It was there's bikes everywhere on the sidewalk. Yeah, definitely. So that's something that, again, we need to be cautious of. I think that in this realm we are more advanced in our thinking, that we have prioritized a clear pedestrian zone that ensures that people in wheelchairs with disabilities have the ability to have, a dignified life and access to services, and we don't want to compromise that.
I would say the exception, though, is this idea that, we're still building multi-use facilities. So I personally am looking at some of the stuff that's coming across my desk, like this Gibb Street Bridge or the Selwood Bridge. I'm like, huh? No, we don't want to do We need to separate these things, and let's not build a facility that's going to be here for another 80 to 100 years and not anticipate that we're going to have the volumes and pads and bikes that will demand separation. So
Great.
Good point.
Excellent point. All right, well, we'll let you go. Oh, last question. All right, we'll take one more question.
Is there any reason why Portland won't have as many work bikes in 5 years as Amsterdam and Copenhagen?
I think Portland is moving towards having a ton of, we're seeing them almost every day on Bike Portland. He's out, Jonathan will put up a different work bike, and the bike gallery is going to start bringing in a back-loading version of this one in the middle. It sort of looks like that, but in the back, right?
Right.
And I think we're going to absolutely see a revolution in more utilitarian and work bikes here. At the same time, I have to say we have this unique thing, is the fixies and the single speeds is a unique part of our culture, and I don't think that's going away either. I think it's interesting. It reflects who we are, at least who the very young people who like those speedy bikes are. That would not be me. But I don't think that those are going away either. I just think that we have actually something a little different, in that we have a very wide variety of bike culture going on from all kinds of different aspects, and that's going to be a little challenging because they've got a very uniform bike fleet with the added complexity of the cargo bikes. We don't have a uniform bike fleet at all. It's just all over the map as to the types of bikes, and how can we, and which is great because that just shows all the different types of people that are cycling or want to cycle or can cycle, but how we can design our facilities to be safe and for all those people is, going to be a challenge for us. So, yeah. Well, thank you all so much for coming. Yeah.
That's great.
Do you have a stick? I'll give you my stick. I have one that has this on it. You want to take it and give it back to me next time I see you? Sure. This has the whole presentation on it.
Oh, great. Can I take